I believe that the secret to producing extremely drought-tolerant crops, which should go some way to providing food security in the world, lies in resurrection plants. Pictured here in an extremely droughted state. Now, you might think that these plants look dead, but they're not. Give them water, and they will resurrect, green up, start growing in 12 to 48 hours. Now, why would I suggest that producing drought-tolerant crops will go towards providing food security? Well, the current world population is around 7 billion, and it's estimated that by 2050 will be between 9 and 10 billion people, with the bulk of this growth happening in Africa. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the World have suggested that we need a 70% increase in current agricultural practice to meet that demand. Now, given that plants are at the base of the food chain, most of that's going to have to come from plants. I believe that the secret to producing extremely drought-tolerant crops, which should go some way to providing food security in the world, lies in resurrection plants. Pictured here in an extremely droughted state. Now, you might think that these plants look dead, but they're not. Give them water, and they will resurrect, green up, start growing in 12 to 48 hours. Now, why would I suggest that producing drought-tolerant crops will go towards providing food security? Well, the current world population is around 7 billion, and it's estimated that by 2050 will be between 9 and 10 billion people, with the bulk of this growth happening in Africa. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the World have suggested that we need a 70% increase in current agricultural practice to meet that demand. Now, given that plants are at the base of the food chain, most of that's going to have to come from plants. Now, that percentage of 70% does not take into consideration the potential effects of climate change. This is taken from a study by Dye, published in 2011, where he took into consideration all the potential effects of climate change and expressed them, amongst other things, increased aridity due to lack of rain or infrequent rain. Now, the areas in red shown here are areas that until recently have been very successfully used for agriculture, but cannot anymore because of lack of rainfall. This is the situation that's predicted to happen in 2050. Much of Africa, in fact, much of the world, is going to be in trouble. We're going to have to think of some very smart ways of producing food, and preferably among them, some drought-tolerant crops. The other thing to remember about Africa is that the most of their agriculture is rain-fed. Now, making drought-tolerant crops is not the easiest thing in the world, and the reason for this is water. Water is essential to life on this planet. All living, actively metabolizing organisms, from microbes to you and I, are comprised predominantly of water. All life reactions happen in water, and loss of a small amount of water results in death. You and I are 65% water. We lose 1% of that, we die. But we can make behavioral changes to avoid that. Plants can't. They're stuck in the ground. And so in the first instance, they have a little bit more water than us, about 95% water, and they can lose a little bit more than us, water. About 10 is 1% to about 70%, depending on the species, but for short periods only. Most of them will either try to resist or avoid water loss. So extreme examples of resistors could be found in succulents. They tend to be small, very attractive, but they hold on to their water at such great cost that they grow extremely slowly. Examples of avoidance of water loss found in trees and shrubs. They send down very deep roots, mine subterranean water supplies, and just keep flushing it through them at all times, keeping themselves hydrated. One on the right is called a baobab. It's also called the upside-down tree, simply because the proportion of roots to shoots is so great that it looks like the tree's been planted upside down. And of course, the roots are required for hydration of that plant. And probably the most common strategy of avoidance is found in annuals. Now, annuals make up the bulk of our plant food supplies. Up the west coast of my country, for much of the year, you don't see much vegetation growth. But come the spring rains, you get this, flowering of the desert. Now, the strategy in annuals is to grow only in the rainy season. At the end of that season, they produce a seed, which is dry, 8 to 10% water, but very much alive. And anything that is that dry and still alive, we call desiccation tolerant. Now, in the desiccated state, what seeds can do is lie in extremes of environment for prolonged periods of time. The next time the rainy season comes, they germinate and grow, and the whole cycle just starts again. It's widely believed that the evolution of desiccation-tolerant seeds allowed the colonization and the radiation of flowering plants, or angiosperms, onto land. But back to annuals as our major form of food supplies. Wheat, rice, and maize form 95% of our plant food supplies. And it's been a great strategy, because in a short space of time, you can produce a lot of seed. Seed's energy-rich, so there's a lot of food calories. You can store it in times of plenty for times of famine, but there's a downside. The vegetative tissues, the roots and leaves of annuals do not have much by way of inherent resistance, avoidance, or tolerance characteristics. They just don't need them. They grow in the rainy season, and they've got a seed to help them survive the rest of the year. And so despite concerted efforts in agriculture to make crops with all improved properties of resistance, avoidance, and tolerance, particularly resistance and avoidance, because we've had good models to understand how this works, we still get images like this. Maize crop in Africa, 2 weeks without rain, and it's dead. Now, there is a solution. Resurrection plants. These plants can lose 95% of their cellular water, remain in the dry, dead-like state for months to years, and give them water, they green up and start growing again. Like seeds, these are desiccation tolerant. Like seeds, these can withstand extremes of environmental conditions. And this is a really rare phenomenon. There are only 135 flowering plant species that can do this. I'm going to show you a video of the resurrection process of these 3 species in that order. And at the bottom, there's a time axis, so you can see how quickly it happens. Pretty amazing, hey? So I've spent the last 21 years trying to understand how they do this. How do these plants dry without dying? And I work on a variety of different resurrection plants, shown here in their hydrated and dry states, for a number of reasons. One of them being is that each of these plants serve as a model for a crop that I'd like to make drought tolerant. So on the extreme top left, for example, is a grass. It's called Erogrostis nandensis. It's got a close relative called Erogrostis teff. A lot of you might know of it as teff. It's a staple food in Ethiopia. It's gluten-free, and it's something we would like to make drought tolerant. The other reason for looking at a number of plants is at least initially, I wanted to find out, do they do the same thing? Do they all use the same mechanisms to be able to lose all that water and not die? So I undertook what we call a systems biology approach in order to get a comprehensive understanding of desiccation tolerance, in which we look at everything from the molecular to the whole plant ecophysiological level. For example, we look at things like changes in the plant anatomy as they dry down on the ultrastructure. We look at the transcriptome, which is just a term for a technology in which we look at the genes that are switched on or off in response to drying. Most genes will code for proteins. So we look at the proteome. What are the proteins made in response to drying? Some proteins would code for enzymes which make metabolites. So we look at the metabolome. Now this is important because plants are stuck in the ground. They use what I call is a highly tuned chemical arsenal to protect themselves from all the stresses of their environment. So it's important that we look at the chemical changes involved in drying. And at the last study that we do at the molecular levels, we look at the lipidome, the lipid changes in response to drying. And that's also important because all biological membranes are made of lipids. They're held as membranes because they're in water. Take away the water, those membranes fall apart. Lipids also act as signals to turn on genes. Then we use physiological and biochemical studies to try and understand the function of the putative protections that we've actually discovered in our other studies, and then use all of that to try and understand how the plant copes with its natural environment. Now, I've always had the philosophy that I needed a comprehensive understanding of the mechanisms of desiccation tolerance in order to make a meaningful suggestion for a biotech application. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, by biotech application, does she mean she's going to make genetically modified crops? And the answer to that question depends on your definition of genetic modification. All of the crops that we eat today, wheat, rice, and maize, are highly genetically modified from their ancestors, but we don't consider them GM because they've been produced by conventional breeding. If you mean, am I going to put resurrection plant genes into crops? The answer is yes. In the essence of time, we have tried that approach. More appropriately, some of my collaborators at UCT, Jennifer Thompson, Sohail Rafidin, have spearheaded that approach, and I'm going to show you some data soon. But we're about to embark on an extremely ambitious approach in which we aim to turn on whole suites of genes that are already present in every crop. They're just never turned on under extreme drought conditions. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether those should be called GM or not. I'm going to now just give you some of the data from that first approach. And in order to do that, I have to explain a little bit about how genes work. So you probably all know that genes are made of double-stranded DNA. It's wound very tightly into chromosomes that are present in every cell of your body or in a plant's body. If you unwind that DNA, you get genes. And each gene has a promoter, which is just an on-off switch, the gene coding region, and then a terminator, which indicates that this is the end of this gene. The next gene will start. Now, promoters are not simple on-off switches. They normally require a lot of fine-tuning, lots of things to be present and correct before that gene is switched on. So what's typically done in biotech studies is that we use an inducible promoter. We know how to switch it on. We couple that to genes of interest and put that into a plant and see how the plant responds. Now, in the study that I'm going to talk to you about, my collaborators used a drought-induced promoter, which we discovered in a resurrection plant. Now, the nice thing about this promoter is that we do nothing. The plant itself senses drought. And we've used it to drive antioxidant genes from resurrection plants. Why antioxidant genes? Well, all stresses, particularly drought stress, results in the formation of free radicals, or reactive oxygen species, which are highly damaging and can cause crop death. What antioxidants do is stop that damage. So here's some data from a maize strain that's very popularly used in Africa. To the left of the arrow are plants without the genes. To the right, plants with the antioxidant genes. After 3 weeks without watering, the ones with the genes do a hell of a lot better. Now to the final approach. My research has shown that there's considerable similarity in the mechanisms of desiccation tolerance in seeds and resurrection plants. So I asked the question, are they using the same genes? Or slightly differently phrased, are resurrection plants using genes evolved in seed desiccation tolerance in their roots and leaves? Have they retasked these seed genes in roots and leaves of resurrection plants? And the answer to that question, as a consequence of a lot of research from my group and recent collaborations from a group of Henk Hilhorst in the Netherlands, Mel Oliver in the United States, and Julia Baytink in France, the answer is yes. That there is a core set of genes that are involved in both. And I'm going to illustrate this very crudely for maize, where the chromosomes below the off switch represent all the genes that are required for desiccation tolerance. So as maize seeds dry down, at the end of their period of development, they switch these genes on. Resurrection plants switch on the same genes when they dry down. All modern crops, therefore, have these genes in their roots and leaves. They just never switch them on. They only switch them on in seed tissues. So what we're trying to do right now is to understand the environmental and cellular signals that switch on these genes in resurrection plants to mimic the process in crops. And just a final thought. What we're trying to do very rapidly is to repeat what nature did in the evolution of resurrection plants some 10 to 40 million years ago. My plants and I thank you for your attention.
Food crisis. It's in the news every day. But what is it? Some places in the world, it's too little food, maybe too much. Other places, GMO is saving the world. Maybe GMO is the problem. Too much agricultural runoff, creating bad oceans, toxic oceans, attenuation of nutrition. They go on and on. And I find the current climate of this discussion incredibly disempowering. So how do we bring that to something that we understand? How is this apple food crisis? You've all eaten an apple in the last week, I'm sure. How old do you think it was from when it was picked? 2 weeks? 2 months? 11 months. The average age of an apple in a grocery store in the United States. And I don't expect it to be much different in Europe or anywhere else in the world. We pick them, we put them in cold storage, we gas the cold storage. There's actually documented proof of workers trying to go into these environments to retrieve an apple and dying. Because the atmosphere that they slow down the process of the apple is also toxic to humans. How is it that none of you know this? Why didn't I know this? 90% of the quality of that apple, all the antioxidants, are gone by the time we get it. It's basically a little ball of sugar. How did we get it so information poor? And how can we do better? I think what's missing is a platform. I know platforms, I know computers. They put me on the internet when I was young. I did very weird things on this platform, but I met people and I could express myself. How do you express yourself in food? If we had a platform, we might feel empowered to question what if. For me, I question, what if climate was democratic? So this is a map of climate in the world, the most productive areas in green, the least productive in red. They shift and they change, and Californian farmers now become Mexican farmers. China picks up land in Brazil to grow better food, and we're slaves to climate. What if each country had its own productive climate? What would that change about how we live? What would that change about quality of life and nutrition? Last generation's problem was we need more food and we need it cheap. Welcome to your global farm. We built a huge analog farm. All these traces, these are cars, planes, trains, and automobiles. It's a miracle that we feed 7 billion people with just a few of us involved in the production of food. What if we built a digital farm, a digital world farm? What if you could take this apple, digitize it somehow, send it through particles in the air, and reconstitute it on the other side? What if? Going through some of these quotes, they inspire me to do what I do. First one, Japanese farming has no youth, no water, no land, and no future. That's what I landed to the day that I went to Minami Sanriku, one stop south of Fukushima after the disaster. The kids have headed to Sendai in Tokyo. The land is contaminated. They already import 70% of their own food, but it's not unique to Japan. 2% of the American population is involved in farming. What good answer comes from 2% of any population? As we go around the world, 50% of the African population is under 18. 80% don't want to be farmers. Farming is hard. The life of a small shareholder farmer is miserable. They go into the city. In India, farmers' families not being able to have basic access to utilities. More farmer suicides this year and the previous, 10 before that. It's uncomfortable to talk about. Where are they going? Into the city. No young people, and everyone's headed in. So how do we build this platform that inspires the youth? Welcome to the new tractor, right? This is my combine. A number of years ago now, I went to Bed Bath & Beyond and Home Depot, and I started hacking, and I built silly things, and I made plants dance, and I attached them to my computer, and I killed them all, a lot, and I eventually got them to survive. And I created one of the most intimate relationships I've ever had in my life because I was learning the language of plants. So I wanted to make it bigger. They said, knock yourself out, kid. Here's an old electronics room that nobody wants. What can you do? With my team, we built a farm inside of the Media Lab, a place historically known not for anything about biology, but everything about digital life. Inside of this, 60 square feet, we produced enough food to feed about 300 people once a month. Not a lot of food, and there's a lot of interesting technology in there. But the most interesting thing, beautiful white roots, deep green colors, and a monthly harvest. Is this a new cafeteria? Is this a new retail experience? Is this a new grocery store? I can tell you one thing for sure. This is the first time anybody in the Media Lab ripped the roots off of anything. We get our salad in bags. There's nothing wrong with that. But what happens when you have an image-based processing expert, a data scientist, a roboticist, ripping roots off and thinking, I know something about I could make this happen, I want to try. In that process, we would bring the plants out, and then we would take some back to the lab, because if you grew it, you don't throw it away. It's kind of precious to you. And I have this weird tongue now, because I'm afraid to let anybody eat anything until I've ate it first, because I want it to be good. So I eat lettuce every day, and I can tell the pH of a lettuce within 0.1. I'm like, no, that's a 6.1. No, you can't eat it today. This lettuce that day was hyper sweet. It was hyper sweet because the plant had been stressed, and it created a chemical reaction in the plant to protect itself. So I'm not going to die, and the plant's not going to die. Tastes sweet to me. Technologists falling backwards into plant physiology. So we thought other people needed to be able to try this. We want to see what people can create, so we conceived of a lab that could be shipped anywhere. And then we built it. So on the facade of the Media Lab is my lab that has about 30 points of sensing per plant. So if you know about the genome or genetics, this is the phenome, right? The phenomena. When you say, I like the strawberries from Mexico, you really like the strawberries from the climate that produce the expression that you like. So if you're coding climate, this much CO2, this much O2 creates a recipe, you're coding the expression of that plant, the nutrition of that plant, the size of that plant, the shape, the color, the texture. We need data. So we put a bunch of sensors in there to tell us what's going on. If you think of your houseplants, and you look at your houseplant, and you're super sad because you're like, why are you dying? Won't you talk to me? Farmers develop the most beautiful fortune-telling eyes by the time they're in their late 60s and 70s. They can tell you when you see that plant dying that it's a nitrogen deficiency, a calcium deficiency, or it needs more humidity. Those beautiful eyes are not being passed down. These are eyes in the cloud of a farmer. We trend those data points over time. We correlate those data points to individual plants. These are all the broccoli in my lab that day by IP address. We have IP addressable broccoli. So, if that's not weird enough, you can click one and you get a plant profile. And what this tells you is downloadable progress on that plant, but not like you'd think. It's not just when it's ready. When does it achieve the nutrition that I need? When does it achieve the taste that I desire? Is it getting too much water? Is it getting too much sun? Alerts. It can talk to me. It's conversant. We have a language. I think of that as the first user on the plant Facebook, right? That's a plant profile, and that plant will start making friends. It will, and I mean it. It will make friends with other plants that use less nitrogen, more phosphorus, less potassium. We're going to learn about a complexity that we can only guess at now. And they may not friend us back. I don't know, they might friend us back. It depends on how we act. So, this is my lab now. It's a little bit more systematized. My background is designing data centers and hospitals of all things, so I know a little bit about creating a control environment. And so, inside of this environment, we're experimenting with all kinds of things. You know, this process, aeroponics, it was developed by NASA for Mir Space Station for reducing the amount of water they send into space. What it really does is give the plant exactly what it wants: water, minerals, and oxygen. Roots are not that complicated. So when you give them that, you get this amazing expression. It's like the plant has two hearts. And because it has two hearts, it grows 4 or 5 times faster. Right? It's a perfect world. We've gone a long way into technology and seed for an adverse world, and we're going to continue to do that. But we're going to have a new tool too, which is perfect world. So we've grown all kinds of things. These tomatoes hadn't been in commercial production for 150 years. Do you know that we have rare and ancient seed banks? Banks of seed. It's amazing. They have germplasm alive and things that you've never eaten. I'm the only person in this room that's eaten that kind of tomato. Problem is, it was a sauce tomato, and we don't know how to cook, so we just ate a sauce tomato, which is not that great, but we've done things with protein. We've grown all kinds of things. We've grown humans. Maybe you could, but we didn't. But what we realized is the tool was too big, it was too expensive. I was starting to put them around the world, and they were about $100,000, so finding somebody with 100 grand in their back pocket isn't so easy, so we wanted to make a small one. So this project was actually one of my students' mechanical engineering undergraduates, Camille. So Camille and I and my team, we iterated all summer how to make it cheaper, how to make it work better, how to make it so other people could make it. And then we dropped them off in schools, 7th through 11th grade. And if you want to be humbled, try to teach a kid something. So I went into the school and I said, set it to 65% humidity. And the 7th grader said, what's humidity? And I said, oh, it's water and air. He said, there's no water and air, you're an idiot. And I was like, all right, don't trust me. Actually, don't trust me, right? Set it to 100. He sets it to 100, and what happens? It starts to condense, make a fog, and eventually drip. And he says, oh, humidity is rain. Why didn't you just tell me that? We've created an interface for this that's much like a game. So they have a 3D environment. They can log into it anywhere in the world on their smartphone, on their tablet. They have different parts of the bots, the physical, the sensors. They select recipes that have been created by other kids anywhere in the world. They select and activate that recipe. They plant a seedling. While it's growing, they make changes. They're like, why does a plant need CO2 anyway? Isn't CO2 bad? It kills people. Crank up CO2, plant dies. Or crank down CO2, plant does very well. Harvest plant, and you've created a new digital recipe. It's an iterative design and development and exploration process. They can download then all of the data about that new plant that they developed, or the new digital recipe, and what did it do? Was it better? Was it worse? Imagine these as little cores of processing. We're going to learn so much. So here's one of the food computers, as we call them, in a school in 3 weeks' time. Right? This is 3 weeks of growth, but more importantly, was the first time that this kid ever thought that he could be a farmer, or that he would want to be a farmer. So we've open sourced all of this. It's all online. Go home, try to build your first food computer. It's going to be difficult. I'm just telling you, we're in the beginning, but it's all there. It's very important to me that this is easily accessible. We're going to keep making it more so. These are farmers. Electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, environmental engineer, computer scientists, plant scientists, economists, urban planners on one platform, doing what they're good at, but we got a little too big. I'm proud to announce this is my new facility that I'm just starting. This warehouse could be anywhere. That's why I chose it. And inside of this warehouse, we're going to build something kind of like this. These exist right now. Take a look at it. These exist too. One grows greens, one grows Ebola vaccine. Pretty amazing that plants, and this DARPA Grand Challenge winner is one of the reasons we're getting ahead of Ebola. The plants are producing the protein that's Ebola resistant. So pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, all the way down to lettuce. But these two things look nothing alike, and that's where I am with my field. Everything is different. We're in that weird, we're all right stage, and it's like, here's my black box, no, buy mine. No, I've got intellectual property that's totally valuable. Don't buy his, buy mine. And the reality is, we're just at the beginning. In a time when society is shifting too, when we ask for more, cheaper food, we're now asking for better, environmentally friendly food. And then when you have McDonald's advertising what's in the Chicken McNugget, the most mysterious food item of all time, they are now basing their marketing plan on that. Everything is changing. So into the world now, personal food computers, food servers, and food data centers. Run on the open phenome. Think open genome, but we're going to put little climate recipes like Wikipedia that you can pull down, actuate, and grow. What does this look like in a world? You remember the world connected by strings. We start having beacons. We start sending information about food rather than sending food. This is not just my fantasy. This is where we're already deploying. Food computers, food servers, soon to be food data centers, connecting people together to share information. The future of food is not about fighting over what's wrong with this. We know what's wrong with this. The future of food is about networking the next 1 billion farmers and empowering them with a platform to ask and answer the question, what if? Thank you.